2009, St. Petersburg, Florida. On February 17, Laura Nimbach, a 22-year-old woman with a restless spirit and a fractured sense of safety, vanished without a trace. Earlier that evening, she had been seen by a police officer behind a building near Memorial Park Cemetery. She was alone, alert yet wary, carrying a lifetime of small scars and a history that few could understand. Her presence there was ordinary, yet something about her path at night walking down an alley, leaving the dim glow of streetlights behind, felt irrevocably final. By the time the city slept, Laura had disappeared. No note, no message, no explanation. Her family, her friends, and the small network of those who had crossed her life's path were left only with the echo of questions. And now, 13 years later, her case remains a haunting void. If you are drawn to the silent corners of unresolved mysteries, consider subscribing, because stories like Laura's are rarely forgotten. The disappearance of Laura Nimbach was first noted in fragments, scattered across the city's records, witness statements, and early search logs. In February of 2009, she had already lived a life punctuated by instability, moving between domestic violence shelters in Clearwater, Florida. For investigators, understanding the trajectory that led to her disappearance required careful reconstruction of her daily movements, her known associations, and the sparse evidence she left behind. Laura's last confirmed location was behind a building near Memorial Park Cemetery in St. Petersburg. On February 17, she had been sleeping there when encountered by a police officer, whose report indicates a routine intervention. He informed her of nearby shelters, advised that she could not remain there overnight, and provided guidance for safer options. Laura acknowledged the guidance, rising from the cold concrete and walking away into the shadows of the night. That movement, measured only in moments, would become the starting point of an investigation that would stretch for years. The official recognition of Laura as a missing person did not occur until March 31st, more than 6 weeks after her disappearance. This delay complicated the investigation, leaving the early hours unmonitored by law enforcement and allowing potential traces to dissipate. When the case was officially logged, the initial team of officers began the painstaking process of cataloging Laura's known locations, acquaintances, and recent patterns. Shelter staff described her as motivated yet fragile, seeking rehabilitation programs, but subject to sudden episodes of anxiety and withdrawal. Her personal history, including past abuse and prescription drug struggles, was carefully noted to understand potential behaviors and risks. The first search efforts focused on the immediate vicinity of Memorial Park Cemetery and adjacent alleyways. Officers walked the streets in coordinated grids, documenting every alley, staircase, and overgrown path. Flashlights cut through the darkness, reflecting off damp sidewalks and wet asphalt. Canine units were deployed to trace scent, but each attempt revealed the fragility of scent in an urban environment. Trails that should have been continuous vanished abruptly, as though the city itself had swallowed them. Teams meticulously photographed and logged every finding, from cigarette butts to discarded clothing fragments. Yet none could be definitively tied to Laura. Volunteer groups joined in, local residents eager to assist in locating the young woman. They moved in staggered formations, calling her name into the night, listening for echoes that would never answer. Some noted anomalies in the streetscape, alleyways that appeared narrower or shifted subtly, trash patterns that seemed inconsistent with the wind, and occasional figures glimpsed at the periphery of vision. Each report was logged but treated cautiously, as the human perception of space and movement can distort under stress and expectation. Interviews with friends, family, and shelter personnel were conducted with methodical precision. Each interaction added layers to the portrait of Laura, a woman striving for autonomy, negotiating personal safety, and maintaining fractured connections with those she trusted. Family members recounted phone conversations in which she sounded anxious but determined, emphasizing her intent to participate in rehabilitation programs. Shelter staff recalled fleeting moments of levity amid tension, noting Laura's intelligence, humor, and occasional irritability when navigating the constraints of institutional life. These nuances informed investigators' assumptions, guiding their understanding of how she might have acted in the hours before. Disappearance. Cell phone records provided the first tangible clues beyond eyewitness accounts. Between 10 o'clock and 11 p.m. on February 17, Laura reportedly called an ex-boyfriend several times. These calls were brief, lacking in substantive content but indicating a continued effort to maintain contact with familiar individuals. The patterns were recorded and cross-referenced with timestamps, although the locations of the calls remained largely indeterminate due to tower coverage gaps. Each data point, however small, became critical in reconstructing her path and understanding the time frame within which she vanished. Physical searches extended beyond the cemetery and immediate alleys. Investigators canvassed nearby streets, abandoned buildings, public parks, and residential areas. Each search team worked in overlapping shifts, ensuring coverage without redundancy. Notes were taken on environmental conditions, wind direction, humidity, temperature, and the presence of artificial light. These factors, while seemingly mundane, were essential in evaluating the viability of scent trails, witness observation, and potential hiding spots. Investigators maintained a forensic approach, measuring and recording every observable element. Small anomalies began to emerge in the early stages of the investigation. Neighbors reported hearing faint noises, voices, or footsteps that did not correspond to any known activity. One resident described a figure observed at the edge of a street, motionless, only to vanish moments later when approached. While these incidents could have simple explanations, they were noted in official logs as part of the pattern of irregular reports surrounding the disappearance. Documented evidence included Laura's personal items left behind at the shelter and her known locations. Her clothing, jewelry, and personal effects were catalogued. Investigators noted distinctive features: her dyed blonde hair, the tattoo of a pink flower with a tribal design on her lower back, the initials LN on her left wrist, and multiple piercings. Such details, while mundane, offered potential identifiers in case of later sightings. However, no items were recovered from the area of her disappearance that could be definitively linked to her presence beyond February 17th. Investigators also pursued interviews with known associates, including individuals tied to prior abusive relationships. Each account was scrutinized for discrepancies, motives, or potential threats. Patterns of contact, visitation, and prior incidents were mapped meticulously, producing a complex network of connections. In every case, attention was paid to the smallest inconsistencies, statements that conflicted with documented time, locations that seemed unlikely, and minor details that did not align with known behavior. The early phase of investigation demonstrated the tension between procedural thoroughness and the fragility of human memory. Witnesses' recollections, shelter logs, and officer statements were cross-referenced repeatedly, seeking corroboration and attempting to resolve conflicts. Investigators maintained a cold, measured approach, aware that assumptions could misdirect effort and obscure the truth. Every new lead was verified through multiple channels whenever possible, and all inconsistencies were logged for future examination. Throughout the investigation, a sense of unease persisted. The city streets, familiar and navigable during daylight hours, seemed to conceal something in the night. The physical and procedural records were extensive, yet they could not account for Laura's disappearance in a linear or rational way. The absence of definitive evidence allowed speculation, but investigators remained disciplined, focusing on traceable facts, documented anomalies, and verifiable witness accounts. Amid this meticulous process, authorities encouraged public participation, noting that even minor observations might provide critical insight. Small details, overlooked by some, had the potential to reveal patterns or clarify discrepancies in the timeline. The case's unresolved nature, combined with the subtle irregularities in movement and witness perception, underscored the necessity of collective attention and careful documentation. The investigation's first phase concluded with a reinforced understanding. Laura Nimbach had vanished into circumstances that were at once ordinary and inexplicably elusive. The immediate environment, her recent contacts, and the procedural records offered no clear path forward. Each lead raised more questions than it answered, and the city itself seemed to resist closure. For those following the case, the early records form the foundation upon which all subsequent developments rest. Every documented detail from the officer's last sighting to the fragmented phone logs constitutes a piece of the larger unresolved puzzle. Even today, these initial investigative steps reveal the fragility of human tracking, the gaps in urban monitoring, and the profound challenge of locating someone who seems to have disappeared without leaving trace. If you have observations or theories about Laura's disappearance, no matter how small, commenting below could provide critical insight. As the investigation into Laura Nimbach's disappearance progressed, patterns emerged that defied straightforward explanation. The first anomalies were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet persistent. Officers reviewing phone logs noted that during the final hours of February 17th, signal gaps appeared intermittently, leaving small stretches of time unaccounted for. Surveillance cameras covering streets near Memorial Park Cemetery captured motion, yet frames were blurred or intermittently obscured by static, as if a faint interference had passed over the lenses. These early observations were catalogued meticulously, each anomaly logged without assumption but noted for potential significance. Search teams assigned to retrace Laura's last known movements began to encounter more tangible irregularities. Compasses malfunctioned near certain alleyways and buildings, reading several degrees off true north despite careful calibration. Footprints that should have continued logically through the streets ended abruptly, sometimes mid-step only to reappear several meters away or at an angle inconsistent with natural gait. Dogs trained to follow scent-lost trails inexplicably, occasionally reacting to areas where no scent was perceptible. Even environmental markers discarded trash, signs, and urban detritus subtly rearranged, as though the city itself resisted a coherent narrative of her movement. Residents near the cemetery and surrounding streets reported their own anomalies. One witness described seeing a figure pause at the corner of a building, then seemingly dissolve into darkness when approached. Another recalled radios in her apartment crackling with intermittent static, independent of any known station, coinciding with the approximate time Laura was last seen. These accounts, fragmented and often conflicting, were entered into official logs. Investigators treated them as peripheral, but could not entirely discount the possibility that these irregularities indicated something beyond ordinary urban noise. Investigators began a careful reconstruction of her steps, layering witness accounts, recorded communications, and physical evidence into a timeline. The alley behind the cemetery, where she was last observed by the police officer, became the focal point. Physical inspection revealed minor details previously overlooked: a scuff on a low wall, a faint impression in soft soil, and traces of disturbed foliage that suggested movement inconsistent with her reported path. Each observation was measured, photographed, and cross-referenced against the city's map of streets, alleyways, and obstacles. Radio logs from police patrols the night of her disappearance also contained anomalies. Some units reported brief, untraceable transmissions interrupting normal communication, described as bursts of static lasting several seconds longer than technical limitations would allow. These interruptions coincided with the window during which Laura made her final phone calls, creating an intersection of unexplained technical irregularity and human disappearance. While no connection could be definitively drawn, investigators noted the convergence as part of the broader pattern of unexplainable events surrounding her vanishing. Physical searches expanded to adjacent neighborhoods. Teams methodically combed vacant lots, overgrown streets, and abandoned structures, documenting every irregularity. Small imprints in sand or dirt seemed to defy logic, sometimes showing gaps of several feet between steps or abrupt terminations, where continuation should have been physically possible. Evidence was collected and analyzed, yet forensic examination offered no explanation. These impossibilities, catalogued alongside witness statements, formed a dossier of subtle irregularities that underscored the complexity of Laura's disappearance. Community members who assisted with searches noted an uncanny quality to the streets at night. Familiar alleyways and routes seemed subtly shifted under observation, almost as though perspective itself had been altered. Shadows appeared elongated or misaligned with known light sources. The air carried faint, inexplicable hums, described by some as electronic in nature but lacking any identifiable origin. Investigators logged these observations with meticulous care, aware that even subjective human perception could carry clues. Investigators reviewed technological data repeatedly. Surveillance footage, though intermittent and partially obscured, was examined frame by frame. Analysts noted brief flickers of a figure moving against the background, appearing in positions inconsistent with established time. Photogrammetry analysis failed to reconcile the figure's placement with known environmental markers, leaving a gap between observation and physical reality. Each frame was preserved as evidence. Despite the lack of clear identification, even seemingly mundane patterns of behavior exhibited anomalies. Laura's repeated calls to her ex-boyfriend, typically brief and casual, occurred at irregular intervals, sometimes overlapping with signal gaps. The timing suggested deliberate movement or avoidance, though the lack of context rendered this speculative. Logs were cross-referenced with shelter records and police patrol notes, yet discrepancies remained. For example, a shelter entry suggested she had been present during a period when phone activity indicated she was elsewhere. These overlapping timelines hinted at a disruption in conventional understanding of movement and presence. Environmental factors were also considered. Investigators measured wind patterns, temperature, and humidity to assess their potential effect on scent trails and visibility. Even minor shifts could account for loss of tracking. Yet these measurements could not explain the abrupt disappearance of physical traces. Footprints, impressions, and debris behaved inconsistently, adding to the accumulating sense that Laura's movements defied normal expectations. The cumulative effect of these anomalies created a tension within the investigation. While no evidence pointed to foul play beyond the standard spectrum of criminal activity, the irregularities suggested a disruption in expected patterns. Investigators maintained a cold forensic approach, documenting each detail while resisting narrative assumptions. The pattern was clear. Laura Nimbach had vanished into circumstances that the ordinary metrics of observation, tracking, and recording could not fully capture. Volunteers and law enforcement alike began to experience a heightened awareness of these irregularities. The city, usually neutral and familiar, became an environment where the ordinary seemed unreliable. Streets and alleyways appeared to shift subtly. Shadows and light behaved inconsistently. Technology faltered in unpredictable ways. While these phenomena remained unexplained, they were carefully logged, forming a catalogue of anomalies that would inform every subsequent phase of the investigation. Through the accumulation of these observations, the investigation highlighted the fragility of perception when confronted with unexplained absence. Even meticulously documented events, the officers citing phone logs, surveillance footage, offered incomplete resolution. Every trace of Laura's last movements contained gaps, and every confirmed observation was shadowed by inconsistencies. Investigators maintained cold professionalism, yet the data itself suggested a city that had withheld clarity, leaving the disappearance unmoored from conventional understanding. For those following the case, the strange occurrences surrounding Laura's disappearance invite both scrutiny and reflection. Footprints that terminate abruptly, signals that vanish without explanation, and faint, fleeting sightings challenge assumptions about movement, presence, and observation. The environment itself, streets, buildings, alleys, and vacant lots seems to have participated in obscuring her final moments, offering resistance to reconstruction. If the subtle oddities surrounding Laura's last hours intrigue you, consider liking this video. Each documented anomaly adds to the tapestry of investigation, and shared attention ensures that these fragments are preserved, scrutinized, and perhaps one day understood. Laura Nimbach's life before that February night was marked by a mixture of ambition and vulnerability. Born in 1986, she had always exhibited intelligence and determination, graduating high school as a model student and enrolling at Wayne State University in Detroit to study nursing. Yet life had taken her down paths lined with hardship. By 2007, she had left college and moved to Clearwater, Florida, in part to escape an abusive relationship, but also carrying the weight of prescription drug struggles that would shadow her daily existence. Friends and family described Laura as fiercely independent, deeply caring, and painfully aware of her own limitations. Her relationships were complex. Love and trust were often interlaced with fear and uncertainty. By early 2009, she had cycled through shelters and temporary residences, attempting to stabilize her life while remaining under constant threat from the shadows of previous relationships. She sought rehabilitation programs and the semblance of safety that she had rarely experienced. On February 5th, she confided in her cousin, expressing frustration and anger toward someone who had failed to pick her up for a planned meeting. It was an ordinary grievance, yet within it lay the tension of a life lived in constant negotiation between freedom and control. The next day she left her shelter without explanation, a choice that would mark the final step anyone outside her immediate awareness would witness. As the investigation into Laura Nimbach's disappearance continued into its second and third months, the case files began revealing contradictions that complicated the search for resolution. Metadata from shelter records, cell phone logs, and police reports contained inconsistencies that, when viewed collectively, suggested gaps in time, location, and sequence that could not be easily reconciled. For example, entries from the domestic violence shelter indicated Laura had been present during periods where call records suggested she was attempting to reach her ex-boyfriend, creating overlapping timelines that could not be definitively clarified. These discrepancies were meticulously catalogued, forming a pattern of ambiguity that underscored the elusive nature of a disappearance. Radio logs from patrol units on the night of February 17th introduced further complexity. While the recordings initially appeared routine, analysts discovered intermittent static bursts and untraceable transmissions, coinciding with the windows of Laura's last phone calls. The anomalies lasted longer than technical specifications should allow, introducing uncertainty into the reliability of the communication network itself. MIFAS reported faint, indecipherable voices overlaying normal transmissions, which were noted in logs but dismissed as background interference. Investigators, however, retained these entries for review, recognizing that even minor irregularities could bear significance in a case defined by absence and uncertainty. Physical evidence, collected from the vicinity of Memorial Park Cemetery, also yielded contradictory details. Footprints found in soft soil did not match Laura's footwear, some terminating abruptly while others appeared at improbable angles. Soil samples and photographic evidence indicated no sign of struggle or disturbance in surrounding areas, yet the pattern suggesting movement inconsistent with conventional walking. Environmental markers, such as displaced trash and subtle abrasions on walls and fences, further complicated interpretations, leaving investigators cautious about asserting a clear sequence of events. Each anomaly was measured, documented, and cross-referenced with witness reports, yet the contradictions persisted. A critical discovery emerged when a search team revisited a vacant lot adjacent to the cemetery, an area previously combed without notable findings. Among scattered debris, they located a piece of fabric, partially buried and weathered. Laboratory analysis suggested it was recent but offered no definitive link to Laura de Fabric's presence. Coupled with inconsistencies in witness recollections, added a layer of complexity. It indicated potential movement through this space without providing direct confirmation of her trajectory or condition. Investigators were forced to confront the limitations of material evidence in a case where absence outweighed presence. Witness statements continued to present conflicting information. One neighbor described seeing a figure moving quickly down an alley at approximately the time the officer last saw Laura. Another claimed to have observed the same alley empty during the corresponding period. These contradictions were systematically documented, each note logged with timestamp and spatial reference, emphasizing the difficulty of establishing a coherent narrative. The layering of contradictory observations reflected a tension between human perception and objective reality, a challenge that permeated the investigation. Analytical review of cell phone data provided further ambiguity. Signal locations suggested movement patterns inconsistent with documented physical sightings. Forensic experts attempted triangulation, but urban density and technical limitations produced wide margins of error, leaving critical windows unresolved. Investigators noted that some calls occurred from locations where no witness could account for her presence, creating a digital footprint that implied mobility yet provided no concrete leads. These data points were preserved as part of an intricate mosaic, suggesting her last hours were characterized by movement that defied conventional mapping. Environmental anomalies persisted. Compass readings taken by search teams in the same vacant lot and adjacent alleyways continued to fluctuate inexplicably. Some readings deviated by multiple degrees from true north, even when corrected for known interference. Investigators documented these irregularities carefully, understanding that while they could result from mundane environmental factors, they nonetheless contributed to the pattern of subtle disruptions surrounding Laura's disappearance. Even the city's topology, the alignment of streets, buildings, and streetlights appeared to contribute to an inconsistent sense of orientation for both witnesses and search personnel. Investigators also reassessed early shelter records in light of these discrepancies. A previously overlooked entry suggested Laura had signed in at the shelter later than initially recorded, overlapping with phone call activity in areas outside the shelter's vicinity. This raised questions about her movements in the hours immediately preceding her disappearance. Additional cross-referencing with volunteer and law enforcement logs indicated minor but consistent conflicts. Timing of patrol checks, sightings of pedestrians, and movement of vehicles in the area. These contradictions, while subtle, magnified the uncertainty surrounding her trajectory. Throughout this period, investigators maintained a measured approach. All evidence, from material findings to witness testimony and technical anomalies, was logged with precision. The contradictions were neither ignored nor sensationalized. Instead, they were treated as integral elements of the case, forming a lattice of unresolved details that defined investigation's scope. Officers and analysts continued to reconcile each discrepancy, recognizing that even the smallest inconsistency might contain a key to understanding her disappearance. By the investigation, a pattern of ambiguity had emerged. Physical evidence suggested movement through spaces in ways that defied expectation. Technological data presented temporal gaps and overlapping locations. Witness accounts conflicted in timing and description, and environmental measurements indicated irregularities that complicated traditional tracking. Taken together, these factors created a complex, unresolved framework in which every conclusion seemed provisional. The case also highlighted the limitations of procedural investigation. Conventional forensic methods, footprint analysis, scent tracking, video review yielded evidence that was fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. Attempts to establish a singular sequence of events were repeatedly undermined by irregularities, emphasizing the elusiveness of the final truth. Even as technology and human observation were applied rigorously, the accumulated contradictions persisted, reinforcing the unresolved nature of Laura Nimbach's disappearance. Despite the absence of any confirmed paranormal elements, the anomalies, with a subtle, persistent tension, the streets, alleys, and lots that had been combed thoroughly appeared unreliable under scrutiny. Environmental factors, technological inconsistencies, and human perception all contributed to a layered uncertainty. Investigators documented each element, understanding that the unresolved contradictions were as significant as tangible evidence for those following the case. These contradictions underscore the complexity of urban disappearance. The path Laura Nimbach took that night, though partially traceable through witness reports and technical records, remains fundamentally uncertain. Each anomaly, footprints, signal gaps, inconsistent witness statements, and environmental disruptions adds depth to a mystery that resists simple explanation. If the unresolved contradictions and subtle anomalies in Laura's disappearance compel you to consider what may have occurred that night, leave a comment below. Your perspective may contribute to understanding the details overlooked, providing insight into the patterns that define this unresolved case. The last official sighting occurred behind a building near Memorial Park Cemetery. A police officer encountered her resting there, and their interaction was brief and procedural. He suggested nearby shelters but could not provide overnight accommodation. Laura accepted this, walking away into the cold streets, her figure merging with the darkness. That walk, measured in moments, became a permanent threshold between presence and absence. Her final hours are reconstructed primarily through the faintest traces. Phone records indicating multiple calls to an ex-boyfriend, the officer's report, and sporadic neighborhood accounts of movement in alleys. Beyond that, her journey dissolves into speculation, leaving gaps filled only by the possibility of choice. circumstance, and perhaps unseen forces acting on ordinary streets. Laura's story, intensely personal and yet painfully anonymous in its disappearance, invites both empathy and scrutiny. Every attempt to understand her last movements underscores the fragility of human perception when confronted with absence. The city, familiar yet alien, holds on to these moments, storing them in corners where no one searches.